Well, joining me first to comment on our residential stories is Tom Panos, Head of Real Estate Advertising at News Corp. So, Tom, I think you've probably got one of the records for auctioneers. I think your clearance rate's around 90%, isn't it?
It's very high. I would. A lot of people would say it's the highest. I hate making the claim. It's arguably the highest in the country. And I've been doing it. I've been involved in real estate auctions now for 29 years.
Now, I guess the perception is that you're the auctioneer, you just turn up and you look at the property and then you just go and take it to auction, but I assume there's a bit more behind the scenes on that.
There is. I mean, there's strategy because, Chris, not all properties have got 20 people registered and fighting over it. So a lot of the times you actually rock up to a property and you might only have 2 bidders. Sometimes you've got 1, sometimes you've got none. So any auctioneer can sell a property when there's 5 or 10 people bidding, Chris. The issue and the challenge is that where you pay is for the mastery to be able to work when you've got limited amount of buyers.
And so is the agent having the conversation with you on that day, or is he kind of pre-warning you in advance, hey, look, Tom, we've got an auction tomorrow and I've got absolutely no one on it?
Yeah, so we get a forecasted indicative figure of how many people are going to be bidding a couple of days beforehand, but the reality is you only get a true scoreboard like 1 minute before the auction, so we actually have a final game plan done at that last minute, Chris.
Right, okay, and when does the reserve actually get set?
The reserve is set, the agent makes a decision on when they set that. There's 2 schools of thinking. Some agents get the reserve set 2 or 3 days before the auction. A lot of agents choose to get it set just before the auction because they're able to have the latest intel on what's happening with how many people are going to be bidding on the property. So it's somewhere between just before the auction and 48 hours before the auction.
Now, obviously in the newspapers and the media, they love to say, oh, this property sold 500 grand or 200 grand above reserve. But in reality, is the reserve actually an accurate reflection of what the property is worth? Because who's actually selling it? Is it the agent or is it the vendor?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because a lot of people would say if a property sold for $300,000 over reserve, maybe the property was $300,000 underpriced. My experience is actually quite different. My experience is that the reserves quite often are actually higher than what the property would have actually got if it was a for sale property.
And is that because the vendor always thinks that their house is better than anyone else's and they've gone to all the expensive auction and so, right, I want top dollar for it?
Oh, it's part of it is everyone thinks that they've got the best home and every parent thinks they've got the smartest kid. So it's that line of thinking. And then there's another line of thinking, Chris, which is that an auctioneer and an agent sometimes choose to have a slightly higher reserve because that slightly higher reserve can actually end up becoming part of your negotiation if you actually don't get the price you want and you start negotiating with the highest bidder, which does happen during an auction. Having a slightly higher reserve is a negotiation tool that the agent and the auctioneer can use with the buyer and say, well, here's the number that we need to reach. What are you prepared to go to?
So it's almost like an excuse in a way, an excuse of another conversation to say, well, look, you're not quite there.
Correct. And what will happen is that at that point, the auctioneer and the vendor and the agent may turn around and say, look, we'll come down X amount if you come up X amount. So it's basic negotiation. We'll concede if you concede.
Yeah. Now, obviously it's different in every state, but certainly in New South Wales, then you can only have 1 vendor bid. When do you decide if you're going to use a vendor bid and what amount might you put in there?
Okay, so the vendor bid's an interesting one because if you actually put in a very high vendor bid, which is what many vendors want to do, because they have this belief that, oh, if we put this vendor bid at this level, everyone's going to pay over that. The reality is buyers aren't that dictated by the vendor bid. Buyers will, in fact, actually pay what they think a property's worth based on comparable sales. They don't care that the vendor's got a vendor bid of $1 million because they need to actually buy another house in another suburb that's more expensive, or that they need to upgrade their car and have a family holiday. So they want so the vendor bid should actually be a level that if I've only got Chris, if I've only got a small number of people that are going to be bidding on the property, I would set a vendor bid that's high, but a figure lower than what the vendor's going to accept. But if I've actually got I suppose what I'm saying is I'll go for the less people there are, the higher the vendor bid. If I've got a lot of people that are registered, or a lot of people that I expect to be bidding, I probably won't even use the vendor bid. But if I had to, I'd start lower because I know that there's lots of people that would be interested. My experience is that getting the first bid is the hardest bid because there's this silence. People are looking around and it's a game of like chess and they're watching to see what they do. What I usually find is once you get a bid, the bids start flowing.
And again, I've seen a lot of, or not a lot, but I've seen some auctioneers say, here's a bottle of champagne for the first bid. So they'll almost do anything as a prize just to get that first person in. Yeah, it's like getting someone on the bus. Once they're on the bus, they're travelling and they're moving forward and it starts going. But also with the reserve, do you, if there's only a few people, do you set that pretty high? Because then if it gets passed in, then quite often in the newspapers the next day it will say final bid or something. It might be $1 million, and effectively that's actually the vendor bid. But does it actually get disclosed? Because does the agent say to the people on Monday morning, oh, look, the highest bid I got at auction was $1 million, so we're trying to get 1.1? Yeah, so that's one of the concerns is that these results are reported on a Saturday afternoon to companies like RP Data, CoreLogic, and agents and vendors are concerned that if the property gets passed in, let's assume the property is worth $1 million and the property gets passed in at only 700, that's not a good look. It's not been positioned well. So that's why when you've only got a few bidders, you'd actually want to have a higher vendor bid. It helps the positioning of the property. And in addition to that, when you've only got one or two people, I like being transparent, Chris, and I like to say to people, well, there's no point us starting at 700 if we know that we've got an owner that's going to want $1 million on it. We'll put in a vendor bid of around 940, 950. Cool. And just as a final question, what do you do if you've got no bidders? Well, you've got no bidders. You're pretty screwed. Well, things aren't great, right? Because as I said to one vendor the other day, he said, Tom, there's no one registered, so no one's going to be bidding. Does that mean the property's not going to sell? I said, well, I can't see any reason why it would, right? So, but what I do is many times I will actually tell people there is no one here bidding, or other times what we do, Chris, is we actually do an auction and we put in a vendor bid. We sit down and we look at certain situations and make up our minds. But the good news is that what I found is even properties that don't sell at auction, they've got a high propensity to sell within 14 days after the auction. Yep, exactly.